we've talked a lot about the microbiome and the soil microbiome and the soil rhizosphere, the microbes that associate with the root surface of the plant. And there's been a lot of talk lately about human health and what the gut microbiome and all this connection. And the reality is there's a lot of good science and studies that are coming forward that shows there's a deep connection between soil health to plant health to animal health to human health. And it's really interesting. So farmers, we are here on the front lines of human health. And that's just really, really exciting. And I'm happy that we were able to have Dr. Daphne Miller be here and share with us today and then also tomorrow morning about what is going on here in the front line of human health and what that wonderful connection is. So if you would, please welcome Dr. Daphne Miller.
So I guess I'm the closer for these 17 minutes, and I know there might be a meal or something between me and the next one, so I'll talk fast. I'm from that other profession that likes to use a jug a lot, which is medicine, and which has also very much turned its back on nature in the past 100 years in terms of how we work. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story because it actually starts 15 miles from here, east. This is me, my third day of my rotating internship at Natividad Medical Center in Salinas. I'd come from, does anybody know Salinas? Yep. I come from a big university hospital in Boston to California to this tiny medical center, which is located right there, square in the middle of Salinas. And for the first couple weeks that I was on my internship, I was just completely overwhelmed with what I needed to do in that hospital to keep my patients alive. So I couldn't think about much else. But slowly, as I started to do my work and started to realize where I was located geographically in California, and what was literally the center of the lettuce basket of the US. You know, we wouldn't have artichokes, we wouldn't have asparagus, we wouldn't have cilantro, we wouldn't have strawberries if it were not for this region. I started to realize that there was this deep connection between what I was doing in that hospital and what was going on around me. And primarily what I realized was that every patient I was taking care of had been harmed in one way or another by agriculture. Sometimes it was really direct, like pregnant women who were pickers in the field coming in seizing from organophosphate poisoning and pesticide drift. Or a worker because there was sloppy system, having his hand amputated in some kind of farming equipment. Or a child who got asthma because of plowing or something like that. But sometimes it was less direct, like the unbelievable rate of fetal malformations that we were seeing in the hospital, or cancer rates that were above average for the United States, or the actual epidemic of diabetes and obesity that was also related to not being able to afford the foods that we were growing in this region. And poverty and worker issues that were related to our farming system and taking advantage of human labor in a way that was not appropriate. So I started to think, if farming can be so harmful, is there a way that we can turn it on its head and start to actually make it something that is pro-health, that is giving health, that is protecting us? And so I went and started to do research and talk to the other doctors in the hospital. And what I discovered was that farming and health were like in two different silos, totally separate. There's no biomedical literature that linked them. Nobody was really even thinking about the connections. And it's because the two systems, in fact, think really differently. Health, when it comes to thinking about agriculture or food, is very much about anti-toxins in the food, anti-bacteria, anti-fat, anti-sugar. That's what we talk about in health, is sort of how to keep people away from this dangerous stuff. And farming is kind of productivity, yield, inputs, calories per acre. And I couldn't find a place where they converged. And so what I started to think was, is there a way that I can start to make these connections? And I realized that what I had to do was go out and start learning from all of you. That I was not going to learn this in the hospital. I was not going to learn this by going through the medical research. And so I headed out to farms to start to learn from farmers. And a couple things became immediately obvious to me. First of all, that pretty much every farmer I contacted was delighted to talk to a doctor and didn't even ask why I wanted to come. They kind of got it intuitively. And also that pretty much every farmer I reached out to, and this was from small farms to big farms to commodity farms and so on, they did truly want to make a difference in terms of the health of their community. They believed that they were put on this planet to protect other people's health, and were also struggling with how to do that. So I realized immediately that I had these terrific allies. And as I was traveling around and talking to them, I was trying to come up with a common thread for what is it that truly is our mutual problem? What is going on where we can find in common and start to address it? And this was the one thing that came up as a theme over and over again that Jonathan was talking about. This terrible loss of biodiversity that we're experiencing on the planet. Since 1970, we've lost half of the vertebral populations on this planet of different types of species. And along with that, insects and plants and so on. We're just a shrinking planet in terms of different kinds of invertebrate and microbial diversity and vertebral diversity and plant diversity. Now, along with this graph, we're seeing a perfect, so what is going on there? Principally, agriculture is actually what is causing the shrinkage in biodiversity. As Jonathan said, it's not the soy, the corn, or the wheat per se, but it's A, that's all we're growing, and B, it's the way that we're growing it. And if you look at croplands in the United States, and those are basically the three crops that we're growing. If you were to put those crops into a plate and sort of look at them, this is really what we're growing in the US, where the yellow is grain and the blue is meat. And by the way, most of that meat is actually grain. So really what we're growing is 3/4 grain in this country. And then, the little red and green there are fruits and vegetables, the green being vegetables, and the blue being legumes. That's what we grow in the US, okay? Now, if you think about it, again, going back to this biodiversity graph, and you look at what's happening to our health in almost the perfect inverse since 1970, this is weight gain across many different nations. So as our biodiversity is shrinking, we are getting bigger. We are also getting more diabetes since 1970, so that a 50-year-old now has more than 2 times the chance of developing diabetes in their lifetime than a 50-year-old in the 1970s. Here in the US and around the globe. And look at allergy rates, same thing. A 5-year-old has almost 3 times the chance of developing allergies to food than they did in the 1970s. Now, you all are smart, and correlation is not causation, right? I can't prove to you that that graph caused that graph. But let's go back to what we just saw. This is our fields, and guess what? This is our plates. This is what we eat in the US. We eat almost in perfect mirror to what is coming off our fields and what we are growing. Now, a lot of those vegetables that we do eat weren't even grown in this country, or we're importing a lot. And as you know, we're exporting a lot of grains. So I'm not saying that it's a perfect matchup in terms of the actual foods that we are growing or ending up on our plate. But the proportions are exactly there. So what would happen if we started to actually think about what healthy diets look like? And we know what healthy diets look like because we've gone to communities around the globe that don't have the diabetes and don't have the heart disease and don't have the allergies and so on. And we see how they eat. There's plenty of research out there. It's not rocket science. It's things like the Mediterranean diet or the Japanese diet or the healthy Swedish diet. You know, you can pick your heritage and your ethnicity. But all of these diets look not like this. They look a lot more like this. It doesn't matter where you are on the planet. These are what healthy people and healthy diets look like. So I'm going to ask you, what would it look like if we made our fields match our ideal plates? What would happen to our health? And what would happen to the health of our planets if rather than thinking no-till and this and that, that was your one rule as a farmer, that you wanted to make your fields match a healthy plate? Well, my hypothesis is if you started to do that, there would be a cascade of good effects, and we would actually get to all those rules we just talked about, but it would actually happen very naturally. For example, you would have less diabetes, and we call it sort of diabetes and obesity, we put together in diabetes. Once again, it's not rocket science about how to prevent diabetes. It's better diet and more exercise, okay, more exercise. But the diet is way more important. We're spending $350 billion a year on diabetes in this country now. $350 billion alone. That's twice what Jeff Bezos has in terms of his wealth. Or maybe 3 times. And once again, not rocket science at all. It is diets like this that can prevent it. And we're doing huge campaigns in this country now to end diabetes. But what are we doing? We're doing this. We're working with insurers and employers and faith-based organizations and government agencies. This is the big End Diabetes campaign. Who's missing from this equation, guys? The farmers. Where are you? Why isn't the CDC working with you? And you look at the food chain. These are all the things we're doing to end diabetes. How about the producers? Why aren't they part of it? Where are you guys in the equation? So these are the kinds of fraud. Now this is a beautiful little 2-acre California farm. I realize it's the storybook farm of singing frogs. And a lot of people in the room are probably rolling their eyes because they're sick of seeing frogs. I know, they're sort of the mascot for, but I love this image because this is the image of diversity. But guess who else is the image of diversity? This guy, you recognize him? He's also making his fields match his plate. So it can happen at every scale. And you know, it's really when he put in cover crops that his soil started to get healthy too. So this is anti-diabetic, all right? In terms of planting our plate. So what happens when we make our fields match our plate? We also have fewer exposures to carcinogens. So I love this quote from the Michigan State professor. A monoculture is like a buffet for plant-eating insects where every dish is delicious. A variable crop is like a buffet where every other dish is nasty. So this has come up several times, and Jonathan illustrated this beautifully. But when you have a monoculture, what do you have to do? You have to spray. And you have to use treated seeds, which, by the way, are probably way more dangerous for the farmer than spraying, even when it comes to cancer risk. We have plenty of data at this point that these exposures put you all at much higher risk for cancer. But it's not just you all. It's the other people in your communities as well. And this was a study that looked at bladder cancer. And the reason that bladder cancer occurs in such high rate for people in agriculture is because it's a lining cancer. So everything washes against the bladder. And they looked at over 50,000 pesticide sprayers in Iowa, 50,000 mostly men who sprayed pesticides. And when they took out the smokers from the equation, because smoking is also a risk factor for bladder cancer, they found that they had at least 2 times, and for many of the pesticides, 3 times the rate of bladder cancer than the rest of the population. So very high risk from these things. And here's the other thing that's happening is just like in medicine, we're running out of new antibiotics to treat the next disease. We're running out of, of these chemicals to treat these pests. So that is obviously not the solution. We need to go to find something else. So by having a diversified farm, you are decreasing your load of carcinogens, and you're also obviously helping nature quite a bit, and you're planting the plate, so to speak. So I would propose that by having your fields match your plate, you're also fighting cancer. Less asthma and allergy. Okay, I don't need to explain any more there. Here is truly a risk factor for asthma, right? And Jeff Mitchell, who's here in the room, really has done some groundbreaking research showing how much particulate matter gets into the air through plowing. What was so striking to me about Jeff's research was that cover crops did very little to mitigate this. If you're plowing, you're throwing this stuff in the air. Here's another way that you're impacting lung health. And by the way, this study was done at UC Berkeley showing that sulfur is just as toxic to the lungs as many of the other sort of non-organic sprays. So it doesn't even matter if you're spraying something that is approved for organic farming. And this was looking at children who were living just within a couple miles of a farm. So, and this is a researcher, and we're going to talk about her tomorrow. She's in Germany, and she's looking at the farm effect and the low rates of asthma and allergy in children who grow up on diversified farms, where they truly are planting the plate. Farms like this in Bavaria. So this connection is so strong that it led Tari Hatala, who's a researcher in Finland, to write this article about how allergy is rare where butterflies flourish in a biodiverse environment. We know there is an unbelievable connection there. So the more diversity that you have on your farm, the more you are boosting all of our immune systems. And finally, micronutrients. And this is something that has come up several times today. But when you are growing a monocrop, it's, people keep on calling this kind of, in some ways, one-size-fits-all farming, and where you don't think about how you're using your water, you don't think about how you're using your fertilizer. This is a photo that I took with Jeff, I don't know if he remembers, in the Central Valley in the middle of August on a carrot crop, where they get 9 inches of rain. And look at the runoff from that crop, and look at the weird colors that are going on. I won't say who the carrot producer was. But this is kind of the one-size-fits-all farming that doesn't work. This is also one-size-fits-all farming, and that is what happens with one-size-fits-all farming. Now, this is an illustration in China of what's happened with soil erosion and plowing and so on. This is an area of China that has naturally very low rates of selenium, but they've gotten worse and worse in the past 40 years. And this is a map of Keshan's disease, which is a horrible cardiomyopathy that happens from selenium deficiency. And can you see? The red on the top map is the areas where there's the most soil destruction, and on the bottom is the areas where you see Keshan's disease. See how they almost perfectly overlap with each other? And that is often a direct result of farming. As we are seeing more soil degradation around the world, we're seeing more anemia, hypothyroidism, immunodeficiency, osteoporosis, which is directly connected to soil minerals, and learning disabilities, specifically associated with iron deficiency. So these are real issues. And I am running out of time, but I want to tell you how when you start to plant the plate and do diversified farming, you're all of a sudden restoring micronutrients as well. And this is Kelly Mulville at Piscinus Ranch. And what they're doing there with their all-season vegetable production is, number one, they have these amazing mycorrhizae in the soil because they're not plowing, because they're growing all year. And there's a lot of research showing that that is actually increasing the nutrients in the plants. This was in a strawberry crop. But we also know that the seeds that you tend to use in a diversified system are also very important. And whereas you kind of tend to use the standard F1 seeds when you're doing that one-size-fits-all farming, you start to change them up a little bit in a diversified system. And so, for example, this is comparing primitive wheat to modern wheat for these essential nutrients that we need to prevent a lot of those diseases. And you might say, oh, for 1 kilogram, that's not such a big difference. But if you think that the average American male eats 81 kilograms of wheat a year, then all of a sudden it becomes the fact that they're actually getting a substantial amount of nutrients from this wheat. And it really matters what kind of seed you are growing. And finally, the third thing they're doing at Piscinus is integrating animals. And it turns out that the best use for meat is for us to grow our vegetables. And that, in fact, you know, when you eat the meat yourself, you're getting a whole series of nutrients from that grass-fed meat that you wouldn't be getting otherwise. But really to think of them on that pie chart as not having grain feeding them, but having them grow us vegetables, and so that we can diversify that way. So I would argue that this is also a nutrient builder. So let's consider planting the plate. This is a little farm that does it. This is a bigger farm that does it. This is an urban farm that does it. This is a rancher who's doing this in Missouri, Cody Holmes. And does anybody know Bob Quinn? He's a primitive wheat grower in Montana. And when I emailed him just yesterday to ask him what else he's growing on his farm, this is what came back, and I didn't even have time to translate it. But these are all the things that he's growing. He is definitely planting his plate there. And you know, the fascinating thing is that other parts of the world have totally caught on to this idea. This is a study that was done in Ethiopia, where basically what they're doing is doing health planning in the field and changing what they're growing so it matches the nutrient needs for that community. Why can't we do that here? Why can't each one of these regions become its own landscape, as Gabe Brown described it, that is really thinking about the nutrient needs of that area? So let's bring health and farming together. And as we start to have the conversations, I just wanted to leave you with these images, because I think they're very, very powerful. In fact, the work that we do is so similar. And if you look, even biologically, the cross-section of soil and the cross-section of skin are really quite identical, both in structure and in function. Or the cross-section of soil and the cross-section of an intestine, same thing. All the layers and the hairs and the villi do the same thing. And this is, one of these is the rhizosphere, and the other one is the vasculature in our kidneys. Can you tell the difference there? And on a microscopic level, one of these is our microbiome interacting with our intestine, and the other one is the rhizosphere interacting with microbes in the soil. You can't tell the difference, because in fact, we are soil. Thank you so much.